So Caitlin, thank you for coming back and sharing another lovely, very timely paper. And I must say, out of all the things that I've read during the pandemic, this stands out as just one of the sharpest and most articulate essays about so many different things. You're talking about everything from, the loneliness of social isolation to new possibilities for participatory technoscience, the inadequacies of warfare, which we did, the warfare rhetoric, which we discussed with your last essay, but also, in thinking about possible cures, how we might imagine shared power structures. Also, crypt time and what it means to be in a body that isn't sort of staying in sync with dominant norms and ability expectations. And I think, crypt time, we hear so much about the mortality statistics of COVID-19. And I think we're less articulate about the disabling tendencies of this virus. So I'd love to just, let you say a few words, and, I've got questions, and like usual, if you haven't participated in this before, people should just feel free to unmute themselves or raise their hands or put questions in the chat. Often it's easier to see the questions in the chat just because sometimes it goes to speaker view. But yeah, good to see everybody back. And Caitlin, love to hear your latest thoughts at a time when Berlin might be about to go into another lockdown.
Yeah, well, thanks also for having me again, and also just to say again, thanks for organizing this group, because it really did motivate me to write this, and then throughout I received a lot of references and the thinking around articulating it. I was able to interweave some of the guests' work and references that I found through this group. So for that, it was immensely helpful. And I wanted to be able to talk with this group again, because in a way, it is a very kind of cross-genre experimental piece, and so I just was hoping in a way to have it be a bit of a working discussion, to talk about the form of it and potential avenues for departures or expansions from these topics, and in part because as an artist, it's very deeply part of my personal narrative and experience in the world, and then also a lot of the relationships with scholarship that I have. But then there are also a number of topics that aren't fully my expertise, such as patent law or something like that. And it was part of the difficulty as well in articulating these things. I think it started off as actually an op-ed for the New York Times that I rewrote it 8 times. We went through, it was crazy. And it was very interesting, the parts that they wanted to remove. And when it was first written for them, it was actually during the full height of the election between Trump and Hillary Clinton. So it kind of got washed away in the news cycle because of that. And part of it was also that they wanted, I think, this sort of packaged narrative of like, oh, I'm so happy and so grateful to be cured, and my life story kind of fluff, and then like, and it's such a shame that not that many people can access the cure. But I was a bit more, they kept removing the parts that I had about race and incarceration, and also about patents and a lot of things about pricing. So actually, as I became more insistent upon the drug pricing issues, they backed off, and then it was very interesting for me to spend more time in watching all of these Senate Finance Committee um, hearings and looking at all of these different reports. So spending more time in that arena and knowing that this is, information that a lot of people don't know. They're unaware of just how predatory this system is, and that actually, as someone who can actually, I think that the part dimensions of the framing of it with the virus, or in terms of the form, which I'd also be really curious to hear your feedback on how you related to the form, or made your way through it, was that knowing that humans do have this propensity towards empathy and for connection with others, that I wanted to try to interweave these abstract narratives of neoliberal extraction through a personal narrative that is at least somewhat relatable, while undoing that kind of or the pointing towards how that puts us in a problematic position with respect to very abstract and large problems, such as viral contagion, microbial kind of particulate immersion in the world, and also with respect to care and structures of care that are immense and require global action. So it was kind of like doing it once, or trying to think about what it means to support radical viral alterity as a strategy, at the same time as understanding the propensity and the need for humans to think through that interconnection. So that was kind of the overarching goals of the essay, and I would just be really curious to hear about yeah, references that you might have, or areas that you were curious to be expanded, or things that were problems, or yeah, just kind of feedback and questions would be really welcome. So thanks so much for spending time with it.
I really loved what you had to say about vulnerability, and I think it's becoming a keyword for me in thinking through this moment. And so you're writing towards the beginning about vulnerability is the condition of being in a body, and eliminating the risks of contagion are impossible. And then in the concluding paragraph, you're talking about how our vulnerable bodies are reliant on each other at a planetary scale, requiring both the intimate care of mutual aid and the cures of biomedical science. And to live among viruses and survive our interactions with them, we have to think like a virus, xenophilic, opportunistic, multiplied in many. So I'd just love to hear you say more about vulnerability. And I think there is maybe all kinds of, like you talk about not only mutual aid, but the sort of the political engagements for a new knowledge politics and scientific practice that might emerge from this moment. And I think in part it's the shared sense of vulnerability that produces possibility.
Yeah, that's a great topic, and I think relates as well to the the kind of how we enforce boundaries, and this. So there's a lot to do, I think, with respect to ideas of xenophobia, and the kind of responses of making sure that we are kind of are able to protect our own boundaries and be responsible for ourselves. And when we mean ourselves, we also mean the nation, and then it can get into very racist territory as well. So this idea that um, being vulnerable and accepting that, having a tolerance for our vulnerability, is a condition that accepting the fact that we do actually have to um, live with microbial life, live with viruses, live with that condition, and also live with toxicity. Um, Means that we have to also kind of move away from that boundary setting, or not necessarily that we shouldn't have boundaries. We absolutely should have boundaries, but that the kind of means by which we enforce those boundaries um, should be very different, and that that is also very much, I think, can be thought of in terms of the commercial sphere, with the commercialization of all of these of the innovations. And I didn't really get to talk about it because actually the Nobel Prize was announced like a few minutes before this was published, and so I had to write some very messy sentences to just say something about it. But the three scientists who were awarded the 2020 Nobel Prize in Medicine for the identification of the hepatitis C virus, they filed every patent they possibly could over their research career for culturing the virus, for identifying, small parts of the genome. And what that did is that kept the research, it slowed it because it couldn't be shared and expanded upon and experimented with en masse by other laboratories. And it ensured that they were the ones who then ultimately came up with the cure. And then that is the cure that has made billions and billions of dollars worth of profit for Gilead, and no doubt for the scientists. So that's also a kind of like, what are the boundaries and who does it really serve? So that's like, I mean, and it's not just to say that only these particular scientists are guilty of, or responsible for an entire system that supports this way of working, but it is these ethical decisions that lead to that kind of hoarding for oneself. Um, it- we take another question from Ziya?
Sure, yeah. And I'm going to stay mostly mute because there's a 4-year-old running around. I was smiling while you were talking, Caitlin, because there's a child hailing me. But yeah, Ziya. You're on mute, I think, Ziya.
Hello, can you hear me? Wonderful. Yeah, I found your piece really fantastic, really rich, and I really enjoyed your kind of, in terms of genre, the balancing of the extremely theoretical with your own personal implication and your own kind of route and journey through that experience. And yeah, I found that yeah, just a really wonderful thing to read, kind of maintaining those questions of your own personal implication and the kind of broad global abstract. And what was I going to say? A few things. I just had loads of thoughts. It was a really exciting piece to read. I've been thinking about this. I used to be part of, if you know, ACT UP, the London ACT UP chapter, most recent one. And so we did some campaigning around drug pricing in relation to Truvada, PrEP, in relation to HIV prevention, but also in relation to this Hep C drug. So I hadn't known about the prevalence of Hep C or that there was a cure or all this thing until a few years ago, and kind of found it boggling that it wasn't more widely known. So yeah, it's kind of anyway, I just had a really lovely time reading your piece and have other thoughts as well, but I'll let other people also contribute.
Yeah, thank you, Ziya. I mean, of course, ACT UP was an immense inspiration for me all my life, and the whole way that HIV is with Truvada, the payment of Truvada as a personal kind of yeah, basically that you have to pay for it out of pocket, and also that there's no guarantee of treatment for HIV either, that a lot of the medications are only paid for if you have insurance, is just astonishing to me. And so this kind of story, I think about how, especially with viral contagion, how it is definitely how it is formed into and normalized into something that is an extra cost for everyone, and that it's not something that we have as a mutual concern for the wellness of everyone. And so I feel like a lot of the issues around HIV/AIDS exemplify this in a similar way. Yeah, and it's hard to know sometimes what to include, but it was at the top of my mind, and as another example, or if, just to focus on this one story that is, as you said, an undertold story, um, and yet affecting a lot of other people, but there are so many commonalities there.
So Susan's also got a question, but I thought I'd jump in since I have something to say related to ACT UP. And part of what I really love about this piece is that you're asking us to imagine this participatory techno-science that's shaped and led more by an expansive set of priorities than those of governance and the profit-oriented elite. And ACT UP has this long history of doing that, and also being in these entangled relatings with the very forces that they oppose. Steve Epstein has the great book about impure science, where these politics of antagonism turn into a politics of collaboration. And in part, I'm also thinking this story through the other Nobel Prize that was awarded. Here comes the 4-year-old. Might or might not get Zoom bombed here. I'm also thinking this story through the other Nobel Prize of last week, which is CRISPR, which is similarly tangled up in this billion-dollar patent dispute, and the stories of the ACT UP alumni who became the first edited people about a decade ago, and sort of put their bodies on the line for this experiment, but then sort of got the excitement and speculation and hope and hype got channeled towards other diseases. But I guess it's, returning back to what you've written, Caitlin, tell us more about this kind of technoscience that is participatory. What can we learn from ACT UP, where we had an initial politics of antagonism, then that impure science and collaboration, reflecting back on kind of this 30-year movement, or 40 years even, what can we learn as similar tactics and strategies are developed in relation to other biosocial communities?
Yeah. So really great question, and I feel like I sort of put it as a provocation there, without necessarily, or as a desire for wanting to re-envision things, and also that the first and foremost, without many of these stories being really understood or known at a general public level, that just making them part of the way that we understand the world, or the patient narrative, because so many of us have chronic illness. Actually, at least in the United States, the figure I know for the United States is 60% of people in the United States have some form of chronic illness. There are so many stories that we all have, and that there's a lot of power to telling them, in order to paint a broader picture of how we can become more empowered to shape those systems that do provide care and cures. But the problem that I'm also trying to identify with something, with these kind of moments where you have coalescings of groups around a particular uh, problem of a disease, of a particular disease, is that, especially with hepatitis C, and I think as well with coronavirus, is that coronavirus is something that is very much affecting so many of us at this moment. But I do foresee, unless there are changes in the way that the virus itself begins to, like if it mutates or something like that, what could happen is that there's a falling away of the way that it affects people as a whole, and then it will become normalized, and the kind of or it could become something kind of chronic, and then kind of put away and falls out of attention. And because there are not these pre-existing kind of bonds of other social groupings. There's not really enough within the experience of having illness itself that can create that kind of community for to really push a system, to push back on the system in the way that a lot of HIV/AIDS activism has been able to do, because there are also other social bonds that pull people together to form that kind of pressure in science. So in that sense, it is more of a provocation about how to think on the whole, how to begin to think about abstract or a kind of abstract system where these modes of participation could come in, and maybe there's ways of really looking at the larger scale on this. And one of the first ones that I wanted to advocate for was to just simply name that they are this is all of the knowledge that does come out of existing structures of pharmaceutical and pharmacological development are ours in terms of what we put in them. This is ours. It is our commons. We do all of this work. But how do we then change the power structures so that it can also be redistributed, the power can be redistributed, and also then the thinking can become more participatory. So I should think more on that, and I hope we all can.
That's great. And I think in a US context, these are going to be ever more urgent questions in a Biden presidency. So we've got questions from Susan, Soraya, Anne, and Elizabeth. And I guess let's just go in that order. I can read out the question from Susan. There you go.
I can read it out if you like. Hi. So I really found your paper interesting. I'm right now in India, and my parents are doctors, and it's really strange to read about these things at this point in time where they are going to hospitals and at risk, but at the same time there is there are all these companies that are possibly doing all these things to keep the vaccines or medicines away from them. But one of the striking things that I noticed about your essay was when you talked about the virus as not a metaphor, and you linked to, I think, a New Yorker article that said that it is a metaphor. And I attended the last discussion that we had with the reading group as well. And a lot of these tropes, so to speak, keep coming up, and like vulnerability, for instance, which is a big question. So even in your essay, which, as Ziya pointed out, mixes the personal narrative with the theory in such a brilliant way, uh, the metaphor seems like, it's very much in the room. So I was wondering, if it is possible to break out of it, and if, as an artist, whether you think the solution is just to focus on specific accounts or local narratives, or what do you think about this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan, for that question. And for your comments. I also said that maybe a little bit as a provocation as well. Well, the New Yorker article does talk about the virus not being a metaphor, and but the and also there's the famous essay by Susan Sontag, "Illness as Metaphor," and so that's also kind of looming there in these ways where I think the provocation is that because virus has such a it has become such a metaphor for immateriality in our culture with respect to social media, and it is a very material thing, and so I wanted to have that as kind of a starting provocation about how metaphor or how a virus really is this very material thing. And on the other hand, at this, like, as at the same time, in order to be able to even conceptualize what a virus is, we require metaphors, and of metaphors at all scales and in all different shapes and choreographies. And that was what I devoted years of my early artwork to doing, was to try to work between materiality and metaphor with space, with fluids, with images, with trying, because we can't see with our own eyes, even the interiors of our own bodies, and require the mediation of technoscience to do so, and especially with viruses and virality. So there are all these mediating moments when metaphor is and forms are required to take shape in order for us to have a material understanding of what a virus is. So in that sense, of course, it's yeah, another provocation that then I let slip, but intentionally so, in this way where I wanted to bring attention back to what a virus actually is, and not just to as this linguistic mode that applies to other yeah, like going viral or something like that. So thanks for that question.
And I might do a little shout out to some of Caitlin's artwork. So some she mentioned in the piece, but others are really playing with the materiality of things. So I'm particularly thinking of these chocolates that you made in the structure of the hepatitis C virus, and then invited people to eat them, and all the intense reactions that emerged around that. But then also the piece that you do mention in the essay, which I had the privilege of witnessing and curating, where people are asked to prick their fingers and give blood to a dandelion. It really destabilizes. All of a sudden, when human blood and substance is there, all sorts of explosive things emerge. So we've got Soraya, Anne, Elizabeth. Go ahead, Soraya, and Stephanie.
Yeah, Caitlin, so I really also like the essay very much, and especially because, the way it starts with this, what I think is an artwork, right? This kind of poem artwork. And also, yeah, the way it integrates the artworks, but also the way it integrates the personal, with these more general questions, but as they are lived, right? So they're not so abstract for me in the way you present them. So I think this is very well. And what I also liked, because you told your personal story about the hepatitis C, it also shows that this situation with the virus is not so new, right? I mean, so you link it up to things that exist. And so these are all things I liked a lot. I did want to ask you, because actually your experiences are very international, and now you live in Germany, apparently. To me, it did sound like an American story, right? So this desperation about this, coming from Europe, impossible situation with the question of insurance in this country that really makes you infuriated. So, I was thinking if this, for instance, I lived for many years in England or in Italy, where they have a public health service, right, which is a completely different story, right? And so I wonder if you can say something, and you try to be in Germany to be able to get to this thing, right? And so that says already something, but Germany is not even the easiest. Yeah, but I think also in Germany, you will always have an insurance, right? But you have to pay for it, right? Well, in England, for instance, you don't even have to pay for it if you don't have money, right? So, so that's the one thing. And the other thing I wondered if, and this would be something that I would be interested to look into, but I haven't. I mean, there are a lot of effort just now to get this vaccine to everyone, right? And that everyone should get it. And of course, the US has again moved out of this arrangement or agreement, but there are arrangement agreements, efforts on the way. And so I wonder, or maybe anyone in the group thinks that there is really the chance that with this vaccine, the story might be a bit different from the one you tell with the hepatitis C vaccination.
Yeah, thank you so much, Soraya. It is a bit of a challenging yeah, this situatedness, which I have in the sort of intro footnote, kind of qualifier of telling, you know, the context in which it takes place of being in the United States, is difficult because I'm not an expert on uh, a whole global picture of healthcare and the whole manufacturing business and develop research and development of drugs all over the world. But I do have some ideas, and especially from yeah, researching it through my own encounters with it. And what I wanted to try to do was to show how, because 9 out of, or 8 out of 10, I think, or 9 out of 10 of the largest pharmaceutical companies are based in the United States, that they really hold a very powerful grip upon pharmaceutical development. And that has repercussions worldwide. And that the way that health insurance works in the United States then also is this entanglement with how the drugs are then brought to market, and why they end up being priced the way they do. And that is something that I had to leave out a little bit from the whole from the essay, just to not get too deep into the health insurance. But it was something that I wrote about and got early feedback from, the when I went into some of the other insurance systems, such as the fact that, yeah, Germany has mandatory health insurance, but it's not universal. That was the issue with that I came across when I was trying to be treated, was that I was rejected from every health insurance, and there's no mandate that I would have to be treated with, or sorry, that I would have to receive some kind of health insurance, even with a visa. So I basically had my visa approved, but was going to be kicked out of the country because I was not able to acquire the mandatory health insurance. And then through this 14-day window of a kind of weird technical loophole, the person who was helping me with the paperwork got me in on the public insurance, and then they couldn't kick me off. And then how those, like how Germany's influence on the pricing negotiations, how France has other kind of power, is very interesting in terms of the ways that Europe and the United States respect the same system of patenting. And that influence is really outsized in the market. And whereas there are still ways and means for other countries such as India to, which they often do not respect the patents for these medications. But the problem is that because of the other issues around manufacturing reliability and trust, for potential cures that India would then be able to produce for the rest of the world as an alternative to the patented drugs, there's not really a system of trust in place for those to become an alternative for the rest of the world globally. And about your other question with the vaccine, I mean, I really hope that there will be, I do see a lot of hope in some of the systems that I named at the very end of the essay, with more and more countries signing and companies signing on to COVAX. But very few and different activist groups that have been working to do pressure. I have been part of the Free the Vaccine campaign, but I just haven't seen a lot of biomedical signing on to the free licensing so far. I've seen a lot of engineering and diagnostics information, Microsoft, and other research engineering institutes have signed on to make sure that everything is freely licensed. with respect to COVID-19, but very few biomedical companies have. So I think that they anticipate making still, they might end up being manufactured and cheaply available worldwide, potentially, at least for a time. But I think that they're counting on making still a lot of money back from governments who will pay a high price for the vaccines. But this is speculative, and I hope, and maybe somebody else in the group has some other thoughts on that.
All right, so we've got Anne, Elizabeth, Stephanie, and then Ziya has another comment about the NHS in response to Soraya, I think.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Caitlin. I absolutely loved this paper, and I came across your work, the life cycle of a common weed in multi-species Ceylon, and as I also use the multi-species entanglement in my own research with social robots, so I really enjoyed this piece, and it's very powerful. I love the last. The sentence here, we must name as our comments what neoliberal biopolitics dispossesses from the public, and we must be specific about it. And our resistance to neoliberal isolation must become so expansive as to saturate the atmosphere. I mean, it really shows how neoliberal biopolitics is really a cult of death, and you show this so powerfully in your piece. And I think my question goes back to what Soraya just said about healthcare insurance. I'm not so familiar about the German system, but I know in Sweden, and I just recently had this discussion whether in Sweden there is mandatory or public healthcare insurance, but in Sweden actually you cannot refuse healthcare insurance because it's free. You can add something, a private supplement on top, but I think in Germany it's different. And as I understand, you had a public health insurance, right? And then you mentioned my doctor in Germany worried that in the insurance challenged his decision, they could demand reimbursement for the drugs and bankrupt his practice. And so I was wondering, can you give us a little bit more detail about this? Is this common that this would happen? Were there other cases? So I would be curious to find out more about that. And then with regard to Gilead, do you know if there is a compulsory or a voluntary licensing on this drug? Whether there exists, the compulsory would be a non-voluntary licensing from the government, which is more rare than the voluntary one, which is between the patent holder and another manufacturer. Do you know if there is anything with regards to that?
Yeah, thank you so much for your generous comments and for those specific questions. I'll just answer while it's in my head first about the licensing. Are you referring to the hepatitis C drugs or to
the hepatitis C drugs?
Okay.
No,
yeah. So with respect to Gilead's patents on that drug, they do continue to maintain the patents. They have been released in certain parts of the world where basically they relinquish or allow for 10% of the drug price or the list price to be sold to those governments and manufactured in other facilities. So they essentially effectively made kind of allow a generic manufacture in different parts of the world. So this was why, for example, and how, I mean, there is a real global priority around Egypt and treatment in Egypt. I think it's crazy, but something like 22% of some parts of the population in Egypt have hepatitis C.
Mm-hmm.
It's astonishing. So, and in Pakistan, there are also really high rates of prevalence. So there's really quite a need to treat in those areas at vast scale. So the licensing is different in those parts of the world. South Africa also has very high prevalence, and but the problem is in some of those cases a little more around logistics. And then the other part that I'm not so an expert on it all, is that there are other drug companies that came out at the same time with different cures that were very similar. And this was kind of their race to get it out, because their patents were invalidated on the genetic components of the hepatitis C virus. So that's what led to the kind of rush to the cure. And so they kind of like were rushing to get it out so that they could be the first. And it does turn out that they had the best available. But that has also changed the market a little bit, in that there are different availabilities of those drugs. And then your previous question, which was, I'm trying to remember, maybe you could remind me the first one.
Yes, it was about this case with a doctor in Germany that worried the insurance might challenge the decision.
Yeah, that was a bit of a surprise. And I don't know so many cases, like how that works exactly. But I was quite shocked. And so what he did, because of the whole ration, and because it, like since then, and also which I referred to Evan's forthcoming book about, like these crazy treatments for cancer, for individualized treatments. There are, since hepatitis C, these with the cure coming out and at such a crazy high price, you know, it has precipitated a lot of other drugs to be priced and just keep going, and anything that can save a life, just keep going. And but at the time, it was really astonishingly high, and also just given the high prevalence in the population of how many people have hepatitis C, that was kind of the concern of the insurance companies, was that they were they could question that. And I was shocked that that was a concern. So he got multiple hepatologists to all confirm that I needed to be treated, so that if his decision was questioned by the insurance company, he would have multiple medical opinions to back him up. And but this is what France did, is that their part of the negotiation with Gilead was that if a treatment failed to work in one of their patients, then they would get reimbursed by Gilead for the failure of the drug. So there are like a number of different negotiations that happened, but they were all being done on this very micro level, which is part of the operation of the kind of neoliberal biopolitics, which I wanted to point out, like how that responsibility ultimately comes down again and again to individuals.
Thanks.
So also on that point, wanted to say I love the image of you drinking your pills of champagne. That was just so fitting, and but also ironic, right? You know, like who gets to afford this at all? And also the, you know, the $84,000 price tag now seems kind of quaint in the context of you know, some of these first gene therapies that are $400,000, $2.1 million per dose.
Yes.
So we've got a number of questions in here, and maybe ask them at two at a time. So we've got Elizabeth and Stephanie, and then Elaine and Abu.
Cool, I'll go fast. Well, thanks so much for this article. It was a pleasure to read. I'm coming from a performance studies background and program right now, so I was very excited to see you just interjecting your performance practice as well in this piece. And I'm wondering if you could kind of frame a little bit about the pieces that you put in and why you put those pieces there, and how you kind of see like performance intervening into our kind of multi-species entanglements, and how performance is going to change or can kind of change with some of these questions you're asking. And like one thing that just stood out to me was in the transfers piece, which has been like on loop next to me this whole time, which has been really great. But just kind of using the body and this really like intimate visual performative act that we're experiencing next to this line, a sharpened awareness of leaking accompanied the formation of my sense of self. And I think that really struck me of how, I mean, literally the milk that you're transferring through your mouths is kind of getting cultured as you're passing it, you know, throughout this whole piece as it kind of loops on. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little about the performances that you put into the article.
Should I take
Shall I?
question? Yeah, go ahead,
Okay.
and then I'll answer
Great.
both.
Thanks. So yes, again, thank you so much for this wonderful essay. I so enjoyed reading it, and the talk has been great so far. So I'm a political theorist, and my questions to you concern, they're related, but the first one is, so for me, as I am located in the United States, and I'm in the city of Portland, Oregon, which has been in the news in some places. We have very strong far right, like armed militias who come into the city and basically are like really trying to terrorize the leftist activists who are trying to stand up, like, you know, against who are anti-racist and trying to stand up for social justice. And so I found myself sort of grappling with neoliberalism a little bit lately. Like, is this the best framework for understanding what's happening, or is it important also to understand neoliberalism as colliding with more, I guess I think the best term is really fascist or neo-fascist tendencies? And is it helpful to think in those terms for what you're trying to do in this essay, is I guess the first part of my question. And then the second question is, and I acknowledge this is an unfair question, right? And I would be, right, it's kind of one I think about too. But I think it's theoretically important. So you have this lovely line, living co-inhabited with a virus for 34 years has taught me that survivance is negotiation, not warfare. And so on the one hand, right, there's the importance of cultivating like receptivity and sensitivity and affirming our openness and vulnerability, as you so nicely phrased. And I wonder if that agenda, for lack of a better word, is complicated for you by the reality of some of these more really quite aggressive, and especially in the US, like armed movements that seem, you know, really determined to keep things as they are, make them even worse for vulnerable communities. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Stephanie, for those questions. And actually, in some ways, I see them as being interrelated because there's an embodied learning with performance that I was trying to kind of create in these different works, and also not being able to have kind of performance-oriented works or spatial works in this moment that maybe a narrative would, and language and metaphor, as Susan's earlier question about virus as metaphor or not, that metaphors might serve to illustrate and may give a felt presence to vulnerability. And I think that this tie that you're bringing up in terms of political theory to fascism is super important, and that I kind of tried to frame and reiterate in different moments of discussing the ways that health and biomedicine reinforce racism and xenophobia and this idea of pure bodies. And that is, again, fascism is a resistance. It's it's like such a reinforcement of a notion of purity and a rejection and intolerability of vulnerability and mutual entanglement and mutual responsibility and obligation. So in that sense, I feel like it's really been a moment where people's anxieties around vulnerability and sociality with the virus can then be preyed upon. I mean, I don't know about you in terms of personal relations in your own life, but everybody's really on edge in terms of interrelations with each other. And that is so magnified and I think brought in on a predatory moment with the ways that thinking around boundaries is yeah, that it can really be taken advantage of in this moment. So yeah, super important.
All right, so we got Elaine and Abu.
Oh, thank you. All right, I thought we'd run out of time. Okay, thank you so much, Caitlin. Okay, just maybe this follows up on what Eben talked about, and also what you just mentioned about boundaries and vulnerability. So I was interested in what you're calling porous relationality. It seems like, you know, there's this one part in your essay where you say here is the critical node, and what's critical for you, what's at stake, seems to be sociality, right? And so what you say, what's at stake is negotiating these uneasy boundaries between two fleshy abstractions, the individual and the multitude. So I think there's also the boundary between the normative and the pathological. And within the pathological, there's the curable and the failures, right? And I would guess that most of us are failures, right? We're mostly uncurable because we're ontologically different. And so the question is maybe more speculative, maybe more theoretical. As an artist, as a theorist that thinks through different kinds of practices, I wonder, how do we think about the pathological as a site for different kinds of sociality? What does a viral ontology invite, perhaps? Yeah, okay, I'll stop there.
You want me to go now? I guess. Hi, thank you. We've talked a lot about sort of the modalities of treatment and the political economies of treatment, and insurance is part of that. But there's an instance prior that you also mentioned in the article, which is about the development and innovation piece of it, right? And everybody's kind of automatic rhetorical response, which is we need the investment. There's no there's no alternative to this model, right at the beginning of the process. Of course, there's no alternative. The TINA thing is the very beginning of neoliberalism with Margaret Thatcher. So we all get caught up in this sort of not seeing and not finding other alternatives. So I wanted to ask if, what are the alternatives that we can see out there for the development innovation part of it? Distribution is, I think, maybe a second step. But I want to think about what other notions of investment we can mobilize. Investment in what kind of investment, what kind of investment we might have in each other. But just even more sort of practically, like thinking about Cuba, for example, right, as an obvious alternative, the lung cancer vaccine being the most hyped one. But has anyone looked at Cuba and COVID, or Cuba and as a kind of an alternative model where innovation can happen with a different notion of investment?
Yeah, wow. Thank you for these questions, Elaine and Abu. Such enormous topics. So I guess I'll just have to be very brief to both. But I also think that those are areas that, for me, I don't have the answers to, and was hoping that at least opening up the questions could then engage or invite thinking around these topics, because I do think that there's so much in a viral ontology, or thinking through pathology, that certainly the thinking through pathology part was also a lot of this topic of other work that I did, and many artists who have inspired me very deeply to undo notions of the normative and the pathological, and to constantly question that. And I think with the virus, what I think it offers also is this notion that porosity does not mean the dissolution of self, and that there's a that relationality is something that is doesn't have these kind of clear ontological borders in that sense. And so then how do we become to think about that in concrete ways? And so I guess part of the form of the essay that I was hoping to use this story was, in a sense, to put hooks into very real world examples of how this could then take shape. Because I think, for me, when waxing romantic about what the viral alterity can bring, or to be purely theoretical about it, it loses its grounding, because it doesn't have the kind of tangibility, materiality of what it is like to be ill, and to negotiate this as with the embodied knowledge gets lost. So that's why I was trying to bring the embodied knowledge in through the narrative. And the narrative has two parts, maybe then to go to Abu's question, is that, I mean, to very concretely, I think there could be, and what I would like is for there to be policy changes for in the United States, and with respect, and also at the European level, I would like to see patent law changed. I would like to see public investments in biomedical innovation have mandatory that if a product is then produced, that has to have a public benefit, that there can't be over price gouging, and as we see today. So there are some very concrete examples of that. I think the questions of how to then ensure that, for example, another part of it, which is that I put a poem actually as a kind of response by Layli Long Soldier. That's a really beautiful, the whole poem is incredible, and in the whole book of her whole book, Whereas, is about the kind of failures of legal action to then become real reparative action. In the case in which she's talking about the relationship between the United States government and indigenous peoples in the US, and how different legal reparations fail to become actually healing and reparative and just when there's continues to be a lack of power. So socialized medicine can be horror if it's not actually held up to be the quality that we do desire and need. So there's still levels, of course, policy is one thing, but then the actual enactment of it is another. So I think that with respect to the narrative part of biomedical innovation, is that what I wanted to try to do with this piece was to make it clear that the story that there's this, kind of neoliberal imaginary of always in the future, this money, this investment is going to go towards the future cures and the future research and development. And it's, always going to be necessary, that is a false narrative. And then to rethink from there what from the system would really need to be changed in order to maintain that that level of innovation, and also that the public benefits it.
So thanks again, Caitlin, for sharing this super smart essay with us. This has been a delightful discussion. This is one of my favorites of the reading group so far. So thank you.
You say that, Evan.
Super smart, integrating so many things. Next week we've got Astrid Trader, who's an old friend who's written some very smart stuff about microbes over many years. So I'm excited to read that. Coming up, we've got Agustin Fuentes, a biological anthropologist, talking about the importance of sociality. With Stephanie just now, I realized that she's written a great piece on bats and environmental humanities, so she's offered to share that with the group. And I'll actually be talking about drug pricing again. Depending on how the election goes, I'll see which chapter of my book that I'm going to share, but there's one called the Cancer Moonshot that is about Joe Biden's this innovative biotech cancer solution that is now costing upwards of $400,000 launched out of Penn Medicine. So again, thanks, Caitlin. Thanks everybody for coming, and please save the chat. There's all sorts of things lighting up in there with great links, so you can just save the chat to your own computer if any of those links are interested. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you all so much for all of your amazing comments and questions. And thanks for having me again. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
you.